Hey guys, welcome back to another read of Dare to Read or Dare to Lead. I'm super pumped up about today. We're going to be talking about, actually, this is for part number 4 of Dare to Lead from Brene Brown. And it's a super powerful one, talking about shame, guilt, humiliation, all the things that we could potentially lead, not only other people, but ourselves with, and how we can get out from under that. Super pumped to have you back here on the book club. Now, before we dive in, I want to take a little bit of a roll call. I want to see who is here with us today. Amber, what is going on? What is going on? Good morning. Of course, my amazing, incredible spouse, Teresa, is here as well. This book is a game changer. I know that you're with me on that, Amber. But so are like 436 other people who are inside of our book club. Super pumped to bring today's breakdown for you. And I have to say, like every single week, it seems like I say this. I say like, oh my gosh, this book has been a game changer for me. And this is my favorite part. But this is by far my most favorite part because I think it's the thing that separates a lot of leaders in the world, the leaders that we want to like actually get behind and follow, versus the other leaders who use shame, guilt, humiliation, and fear in order to get people to take action. And that is never where I want to be. However, I have found that I sometimes still, even to this day, use that, and I don't want to use that anymore. Not only for other people, but really for myself, because shame is one of those things where if you get down into the shame spiral, it'll actually prevent you from leading the way that you want to. It'll prevent you from being vulnerable. And so guys, super pumped about book club number 4 or call number 4. If you haven't seen the other ones, I'll leave those in the show notes. But welcome to today's call. And here's what I like to do is I like to actually break down the books in terms of like the chapters, but have it be a piece where even if you haven't read the first part of the book, you're still going to be able to get a lot out of today's presentation, just because of how powerful the book is. But also I'm going to be making some tweaks, not some tweaks, but I'm going to be really sharing like how I took some of the certain messages that she said, and really like labeled it towards our business, because I know a lot of what she does is she teaches leadership in big organizations. And I like to make the spin in terms of like how this applies to our business and then how does it apply to our personal life. So guys, welcome to Modern Leadership, where we see things differently. We help entrepreneurs become successful, not only in their home life, but also in their business without having to struggle through overwhelm or sacrificing family time or burning themselves out. That's what we do here on the channel. We have Thursday book club calls where we take a book. This one, of course, Dare to Lead. We dive into it for at least a month and we share our takeaways so that we can grow exponentially as a team. Now, as we are going, I do want to hear, Amber, I do want to hear from you, especially like what your takeaways are from these chapters. If you have that right now, you've already read this chapter, which is, I think it's part number 4 and part number 5. I do want to hear your big takeaways. I'll actually be going through the book and sharing some of the highlight sections that like I highlighted in under 42 different colors because they were so powerful to me. But also as we go, I do want to hear your takeaways, even from this call. So if you have not read the book yet, it's okay. You're never behind in this book club. You just jump in, you dive in, you take what you need to take, and you move on, and you continue to grow as a human, which will help you grow as not only as a business owner, but also as a parent and as a spouse. So let us dive in. Now, last week, we talked a little bit about the 16 specific examples of armored leadership that emerged from her current research. So basically, it's what she finds that happen, and there's 16 different versions of this, when we put on our armor, meaning we're unwilling to open our heart to other people. And like, that was a really, really great call. And thank you guys so much for all the feedback that you've given me on that. I actually really enjoyed that call as well, because it brought up a lot of things, not only for my life as a coach and in my business, but also through my life and experience when it comes to being on LAPD for 20 years and seeing how some of that was actually things that were happening. I had physical armor, but then I also had that like invisible armor that I was putting in there. Now, the reason why we're going to dive into shame and humiliation and guilt and blame and all that kind of stuff is what she says here at the end of the last chapter that we read. She says, if shame and blame is our management style, or if it's a pervasive cultural norm, we can't ask people to be vulnerable or brave. Shame can only rise to a certain level before people have to armor up and sometimes disengage to stay safe. So there's a bunch of parts to this equation. The first part that we've been really talking about is like how to be vulnerable, how to bring up certain conversations and certain things that give you the ability of really connecting with people and connecting with their hearts, right? And when we're able to do that, it opens us up to like so many great things. But one of the things it could open us up to is potentially it could open us up to shame. And that obviously depends on the environment that we're in. But as a leader and as a business owner, it is our responsibility to make sure that we have an environment that is free from shame, guilt, humiliation, all those kind of things, right? Now, we're going to talk about the differences between them because honestly, I used to interchange these words all the time. And when I read this, I was like, this is such a game changer because just even understanding it and being able to label it, whether or not it's one or the other, has been a game changer for me just in and of the last week. So that's why we're going to be talking about shame today, is it could very easily, after somebody's had that vulnerable moment, it could be the thing that prevents them from having any more vulnerable moments in the future. It could really prevent them from actually being able to connect with other people in the future, right? So Amber says, so with shame, how she separated the differences between them all. Yes, so we're going to go into that. We're going to go into that for sure, okay? So she starts out, and this is going to be on page 119. She says, shame, which is often referred to as the master emotion by researchers, is the never good enough emotion, meaning I'm never good enough. She's like, over time, it can stalk us over time or wash over us in a second. Either way, it's the power to make us feel like we're not worthy of connection, we're not worthy of belonging, or even love is unmatched in the realm of emotion. If we lean into vulnerability and resist the urge to armor up, and that leads to us feeling blamed, put down, ignored, or pushed away, shame can deal such a painful blow to our sense of self-worth that just the fear of it can send us running from vulnerable rumbles. Now, she talks about rumbles, just basically like conversations where, like, let's say you're struggling with something and somebody in, whether even it's one of your clients or one of your customers, asks you about it. It's very easy for us to kind of like armor up and pretend like that doesn't exist. But in reality, when we actually can lean into it and say, this is something that's going on, or this is something that I'm struggling with, and then the other person feels open to like asking us questions about it, and we're actually asking them, like, tell me more about that. Like, what is it you think that I should be doing or not be doing? And we open up that door of conversation, but it could potentially lead to shame if we make sure that we're not in the right environment or we're not creating the right environment. Now, the way that she talks about shame, she says, this is shame 101, and it's on page 125. She says, we all have it. Shame is universal and one of the most primitive human emotions that we can experience. The only people who don't experience shame are those who lack the capacity of empathy and human connection. She's like, here's your choice. Fess up to experience shame, or admit that you're a sociopath. And quick note, she says the only time that shame seems like the only time that shame seems like a good option. So we all experience shame. You're going to learn in a couple minutes. One of the things that she said is like, generally we will have, when we're having like certain conversations come up where we're judging other people, sometimes, a lot of times it has to do with like things in areas of our life that bring us shame. And so we're doing that to kind of like as a way of protecting ourselves. But she says that's number 101 is shame 101 is everybody has shame. Number 2 is we're all afraid to talk about it. Just the word is uncomfortable. I mean, even just like saying this on YouTube video, how many people are going to like disconnect just because of the idea of shame or the idea of vulnerability? Even those words like have a weird context in our body, right? And number 3 is the less we talk about it, the more control it has on our lives. I think this is such a powerful thing, and it's a reason why we actually are doing this book club is because we're talking about it. It's very easy to read notes on a page and just have it be to yourself. But when we start to like verbalize it out loud, when we start to like communicate that with other people, it could very easily lead down those other paths, right? And this is what we have to do. We have to be willing to dare to lead. We have to be willing to lean in and get uncomfortable and share these things and talk about the things that most people aren't talking about because it exists, right? There's nothing worse than like having something that holds you back and you have no idea what it is and you're like unwilling to actually even find it, right? You're just stuck. You just have no idea what to do, right? And so putting a name to it is such an important piece. And this isn't just with shame, it's with other things too. She says, first, shame is the fear of disconnection. As we talked about in the midst of vulnerability, we are physically, emotionally, cognitively, and spiritually hardwired for connection, love, and belonging. Connection, along with love and belonging, is why we are here, and it's what gives us purpose and meaning to our lives. Shame is the fear of the disconnection. It's the fear that something we've done or failed to do, an ideal that we've not lived up to, or a goal that we've not accomplished, makes us unworthy of connection. Shame has a lot to do with us feeling like we're on a planet by ourselves, we're alone, we're the only person who's experiencing this, and it's because there's something wrong with us. It's such a big game changer when you can just name that feeling, right? That feeling of shame. She says the things that we have to do is we have to be willing to recognize and talk about shame to get out from under it. If we ignore it, we pretend like it doesn't exist, it doesn't go away. It actually gets worse. And so this is when we can start naming our shame. Now, the difference between these 4 words, shame, guilt, humiliation, embarrassment. This is a big thing for me, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this. She says, shame or guilt is I did something bad. Shame is I am bad. That's a huge deal and difference, right? Give an example in your business. Like, let's say you're doing a webinar, or you're doing a video, or you're doing a post, and you say something that's that's out of alignment from your core values. And you just say like, man, like I made a mistake on that webinar. I made a mistake in that post. It's the feeling of guilt. But the great thing about guilt, and this is not a great thing, but the thing about guilt is that you're not attached to it necessarily, other than the fact that you took a specific action. But shame is like, I am bad. That's like saying like, I am just not a good marketer. I am just not good at selling. I'm just not a good parent. That is shame. Maybe when you think about guilt is like, I yelled at my kids and I shouldn't have done that. That's kind of like guilt. The shame is like, I'm a bad parent. You see the difference there? And it's different. It's a huge game changer when you think about that, not only in your parenting and your relationships, but also in your business. If you do something that's not in alignment with it, feeling guilt is just like, I could do something different. But feeling shame, like I'm not good enough, when you compare yourself to somebody else. Look at them. They're so much better than me. You're using shame against yourself, basically saying there's no way that you could ever get any better, right? And it's kind of like putting a label on ourselves. Huge two distinctions. So don't use guilt and shame interchangeably. There are two very distinct things. She says, shame exists. Where shame exists, empathy is almost always never present. We'll talk about empathy, but that's like the cure for shame. We'll talk about that in a minute. She says, empathy and values live in the contours of guilt, which is why it's a powerful socially adaptive emotion. She says, when we feel guilty, we feel guilty when we hold up something we've done or failed to do against our values and find they don't match. It's a psychologically uncomfortable feeling, but it's one that's helpful because now we're disassociating ourselves from that action and not saying that that's just what we do. We're just saying like we did that action and we want to do it differently next time. Shame is making it a part of you, like saying this is me, there's something wrong with me, and I'm never going to be able to get any better, right? Now, humiliation is another word that we often confuse with shame. She says the good distinction between this is people believe they deserve their shame, but they don't believe they deserve their humiliation. So if somebody tells me like, Mark, you're a terrible business leader, I could take that as shame where it's like, man, like, yeah, like maybe I really am, like, and I could use that as an internal fight against myself to actually produce shame. But I can also use that as humiliation, which is like, man, that's mean of them to say. Like, why would they say something like that? And there's a different distinction there because if it's shame, once again, it's about me. If it's humiliation, it's more about them. And the fact that why would they do that, or why would they say that, or why would they act like that, right? It could even be for like a teacher at school. If they're like, hey, you're stupid, you're never going to be good at math, right? I could take it as shame, or I could take it as humiliation, which means they're the ones who are doing it. And there's some issue that they have with even communicating or telling me about it, right? So humiliation is way different than shame. And then there's embarrassment. She says this is like the one that's the least, it's actually the least worst version of it, because embarrassment it can be fleeting, but a lot of times when we feel embarrassed, we can also picture like other people who've been embarrassed. We kind of like in the moment, it's kind of like a fleeting feeling, but then later it's kind of like, oh, you know what? Other people have been embarrassed too. Other people have done this kind of stuff too. And we can convince ourselves like, this is just not a big deal and kind of move on. So those are the four different words and what they mean. Like even just defining those is like worth this whole entire book, because when you dive into those four things and you can differentiate between each one, you know which one you're feeling. You can see when you're actually experiencing shame yourself, but also when you're using shame for other people. And I'll explain that in a few minutes because I see that actually happening quite a bit on social media. And it's definitely something that I really want to call out to. But I'll explain that in a second, all right? She's like, how shame works at work. I want to explain this in terms of how it works at business. She says, looking for shame in organizations is like inspecting a home for termites. While you walk through the office, if you see it happening, then just to let you know, it's something that's a full-blown threat to your culture. These are things like perfectionism, favoritism, gossiping, back-channeling, comparison, self-worth tied to productivity, harassment. She has a whole list of things here on page number 131. But I'm going to show you like how I see this happening, especially in the online world. In the online world, you can definitely tell when people are using shame versus empathy in their message, in their videos, in their posts, in their workshops, and everything that they do. And this is a very big thing that I want you to be and pay special attention to. And I want to tell you, like, I did not do this right for a long time. I actually found that I was using shame, I was using guilt, and I was using that to try to get people to take action. And here's the thing, because we as humans, we kind of like, because of our belief system, because of our BS, right? Because of our belief system, we interpret certain things that happen, and sometimes we can use it to actually motivate us, and sometimes we can use it to actually use and bring out shame instead, right? So it's not saying that this is never right in any circumstances, but I can tell you from me as my leadership perspective, I never want to use shame or guilt to lead with that. Even though sometimes I can feel when people use it against me, and it can sometimes be my superpower of like, oh, really? Like, that's what you think? Let me show you, right? And it's a different kind of energy, but not everybody has that kind of energy. A lot of people go down the path of shame when it's presented, right? If you're a life coach, you're a push coach in our school, you know that the facts are things that everybody can agree on, but we all have different interpretations of how other people show up in the fact line, depending on the words they specifically use, right? So here's an example. If you have a post or a video that's like, what do you mean you don't have time to work out? Everybody has 24 hours in a day. If it was important to you, you'd make the time to do it. Now, I don't know why my head's doing this when I'm doing it. I don't know. And I promise you, like, I used to make this kind of stuff, like back in the day when I first got started, it was meant to try and motivate people. And some people would be motivated, but a lot of people would be like, who do you think you are? You know what they would start to do? Well, you don't know because I have more kids than you. I have this job, I have this going on, I have a business, I have this and that and that and that and that. And that's why it feels to them, they're using it as shame against themselves because they're the only people who actually experience that. Now you could have that same exact post and you can talk about like the experience that you had that you thought you didn't have time and that you realized that when you were getting down to it, you realized that there were some things that you were like holding against yourself. There were some things that you were like not allowing to like step in so that you could maximize your time, so that you could outsource some of the stuff. And you were constantly being bombarded by people who are saying, you just have the time, you can make the time. And that was never helpful at all. Instead, what I did was I leaned into personal growth and personal development. I figured out how could I start working my schedule to make it a little bit better, not shaming or guilting or humiliating myself, but just more thinking about like, what would be possible? Like if I could excel in both of these areas, like what would that do for me and for my life? And instead of using guilt, shame, or humiliation, which is the first part of like saying everybody's got 24 hours in a day, you lean down the path of your heart and you can explain some of the things that you went through. What that does is you're able to empathize with people. They're not going to feel like, oh, well, and if you've ever gotten this, like, I just can't do what she's doing. It's because they're feeling like they're disconnected from you, right? But when you can actually get down on their level, when you can share a little bit of vulnerability and you use that heart voice instead of the head voice, right? You're able to actually help make a bigger impact in their life because you can empathize with them. You can sort of like get them to see like that you felt that way before, like you've been put in that situation before or a similar situation, not the exact one as them. Please don't ever say that like, oh, I know exactly what you're feeling, because you don't know exactly what they're feeling. The job of empathy is for you to ask questions so you can find out how they're feeling and see it from their perspective, but you also can't put yourself in their body either, right? And even if the same exact thing happened to you, you can't go over here and say that that same exact thing is happening to them, right? So for example, my son Andrew was born 1 pound 9 ounces. He spent 73 days in the NICU. Does that mean that everybody else who has a baby that spent 73 days in the NICU has the same experience as me and the same feelings as me? The answer is no. But in order for you to really get into that empathy part, you have to ask questions to find out how can I see it from their perspective? And their perspective is not wrong. That's a big one. I actually teach this process inside of our programs. It's called the LEAD model. And it's a way of like communicating and labeling and then empathizing with somebody, but not because you're saying that the way that they're feeling is wrong. It's because you're actually getting in there and seeing how in that situation you probably would have felt or done or said or thought of that the same way, right? Because that's what really gets us to feel connected, right? Because we feel like we're not the only people on the planet who's ever experienced this, right? And by the way, if you've ever yelled at your kids, welcome to the human race, because I don't really know of anybody who's literally not yelled at their kids, but we use that sometimes to make us mean that we're bad parents. And it has nothing to do with that. It's just about another skill that we can learn, right? Another way of leaning into patience, but not using shame to actually do that, because shame is just like, I'm bad and there's nothing that I'm ever going to be able to do to be able to get better, right? So that's how I see it coming up on social media. Now, if that's working for you, go for it. Knock yourself out. Number two, like it never worked for me. Actually, it did kind of work in the beginning, but I didn't feel good about myself. I felt like I wasn't living in integrity. I wasn't making the impact. I wasn't leading how I wanted to. I want to motivate, inspire others so they can go out and get after it. And doing it in a way that felt like a little bit like shame or guilt or humiliation, especially the more that I read this book, was not the right way for me. But if it's the right way for you, that's cool. I'm not saying there's anything wrong, or I'm not shaming or guilting you at all in anything. I'm just saying like you've got to find your way. And for me, this is my way. All right. Now, she talks really quickly about shame resiliency, and she says it's the ability to practice authenticity when we experience shame, to move through experience without sacrificing our values, and to come out on the other side of the shame experience with more courage, compassion, and connection than we had doing it, that we had going in. Ultimately, shame resilience is about moving from shame to empathy, which is the real antidote for shame. So we're going to talk about empathy real quick, all right? Now, she has a story here I'm not going to get into, but definitely you can read this. But really, it's like different situations that come up that we could experience this feeling of shame, and how empathy can really work to help bridge that gap. Now, there's a couple different skills that she talks about. I'm going to go through these really, really quickly. These are really powerful skills, but they take practice, guys. You're not going to get it right. I know a lot of people are like, well, I've got to get it right first. Like, what if I say the wrong thing? And then it prevents us from actually reaching out in that moment, in that time when somebody needs us to really connect. And the worst thing of all is like, 3 weeks later, we're like, oh man, I really wish I would have done that, right? And instead, it's leaning in, being vulnerable, being willing to get on the phone, being willing to have a conversation with somebody, and really practicing empathy, because it is a skill. It's not something that's going to come automatically, right? All right, empathy skill number 1 is, she says, to see the world as others see it, or perspective taking. She says one signature mistake with empathy is that we believe that we can take our lenses off and that we can look through the lenses of somebody else. We can't. Our lenses are soldered on. What we do, however, is honor people's perspective as truth, even when they're different than ours. So if somebody's a different race than me, somebody's a different sex than me, somebody's a different, in a different department than me, somebody's a different type of coach than me, like they have different perspectives because of all of the things that they've grown up in, all the things that they've learned, all the experiences that they've been a part of. It is completely unfair for me to say my perspective is right and their perspective is wrong, even though I think that that's what a majority of the world does. Instead, we have to be willing and open, which is what empathy is, to see things from their perspective. Not that we can literally put ourselves in their perspective, because we can't. We can't do that, right? But what we can do is we can ask questions and we can connect to the feelings, the underlying feelings, and maybe times that we have felt like that, and being able to see that it's not that it's a wrong perspective, it's their perspective, right? I always think about this is like, whenever somebody else gets angry or frustrated and they show up the way that I'm like, I don't want to show up like that, I still constantly in the back of my mind think, to them, this makes total sense. Like it made total sense to them to say those things. It made total sense to them to do those things, right? And it's just a different perspective when you can actually think about it that way. Like I remember actually hearing a podcast and they were like, have you ever been in Los Angeles where you're like driving down the street and like before you know it, there's this person who cuts you off and they're like cutting people off and off. And then they get off the freeway and you're like, what in the heck? Like what's going on? What is so important that you're like trying to cut through traffic that you're going to create an accident? And it's the perspective of, we don't know what's going on. But what if we found out later that they were at the ER and they were rushing there because their husband was having a heart attack in the car and they had to get there as quickly as possible, right? That's called a perspective shift. And when we use empathy, what we realize is that we can see things, try to see things through somebody else's perspective, because it's not wrong, it's their perspective. And when we're able to do that, believe it or not, they're much more likely to also want to see things through our perspective. It's kind of like this thing that comes back, right? But you have to be really not only willing to do that, but also authentic at doing that, not doing that just so they can see your perspective. But I can't tell you how many times I've done that. And it's come back where, not always, but it's come back where people have been willing to see my perspective because I saw it in theirs first. It's this modeling, guys. I know we talk about it a lot in all of our programs, right? Modeling the behavior that you want to see from others. And if you want to see more empathy, you have to practice empathy. If you want to see more vulnerability, you have to practice vulnerability. If you want to see other people being open to seeing different perspectives, you have to be open to seeing different perspectives and making it visible to them, all right? Sorry, I got a little bit too into that one. That was like one of my biggest points. Empathy skill number 2 is to be non-judgmental. That one's super simple. Don't judge them, all right? Set your expert role aside. Set your current position aside. Push it all away and just get curious. This is a really prime thing in our life coach school, is because when you are curious, when you're asking questions, you're not leading them down a path and you're not telling them what to do. You're asking them questions because you're legitimately curious about what's actually under the hood, what's happening, what you can do, how you can help, what their perspective is like. Why would they feel that way? Say that, do that. And you're curious because you want to get to the root of what's actually going on. You can't do that if you're trying to steer the conversation. This is one thing that I did not do well early on in my police career. It was like, okay, like I'll wait for you to stop talking so that I can start talking, right? And I realized that that was the wrong path to go down. If I really wanted to connect with people and get it to the point where even now, like when I would arrest somebody, they would thank me and they would write me a commendation for how nice I was to them. It's because I decided to experience or let them experience empathy, right? Not only did I get to practice it, but I really, truly believed it. And it just was a totally different level when you're willing to experience that or lean in and not be judgmental, not make your own opinions matter with that, right? Just you're cleaning your slate. We call it, as a coach, we call it staying out of the pool, coaching yourself. And that is like you're coming with a blank slate and you're leaning on them by asking them questions to really help identify like what it is that they're going through so that you can see their perspective. And when you can connect with them on that level, it make them much more open to connecting on the other level. That's the reason why people were always asking me like, Mark, like, how come you didn't get in so many fights or so many uses of force on duty? And it's because when you're connecting with people on this level, you're not doing this. I mean, there's every once in a while, there's going to be something that does happen. But in reality, when you're able to be empathetic and really connect with them, it just totally changes the game. All right, empathy skill number 3 and number 4, connected. She says to understand another person's feelings and then to communicate your understanding of that person's feelings. Now, the way that I like to do this is it's kind of like, it sounds like you're feeling, from what you said, it sounds like, and basically what I'm doing is I'm allowing them to try it on for size. So if I tell my son, and I'll give you a perfect example of this empathy in action, because I was literally teaching this process when something happened at my kid's school. And when I did that, it was something that I was actually able to, not only in the process, but actually be able to experience myself by helping my son through this. But when we think about like communicating it, when we say something like, it sounds like you're very upset. It sounds like you're very angry. It sounds like you're feeling a little depressed. It sounds like when you do that, you give them the ability of saying, no, I'm not depressed. I'm pissed off, right? And you give them the ability of saying it out loud, because remember, shame and all those kind of things, they can't exist. They struggle with existing when you don't call out to it, right? But when you call it to the specific emotion, it gives it some like tangibleness. I don't know if that's a word. I remember like when my son was going through some of the different therapy sessions and whatnot with his counselor. And she was talking about this. She's like, let's get really good at naming your emotions. And I can't tell you how powerful that was, because now he can communicate that. He's like, no, I'm not upset. I'm angry. I'm furious. I'm whatever. And that allows us, because when we even hear those words, it makes it so much easier to connect with that, right? So if I say, oh, it sounds like you're feeling frustrated, and you're like, I am feeling frustrated. Think about the power of that, by the way. Now they're basically telling you like, you're listening. Yes, I am furious, right? And it's not something that's right or wrong. It's just you're testing it by the way that you have that language. You're not saying, man, you must be really furious. Like, that's not really testing. It's you telling them what they are. But instead, when you ask them, it just does this great job of them being able to communicate with you, all right? So that was 3 and 4. And then now she says, navigating the iceberg, which is empathy skill number 5, is mindfulness. She says, I borrow the 5th element, mindfulness, from Kristen Neff. She says, mindfulness is taking a balanced approach to negative emotions so that feelings are neither suppressed nor exaggerated. We cannot ignore our pain and feel compassion for it at the same time. Mindfulness requires that we do not over-identify with our thoughts and feelings so that we are caught up and swept away by negative reactivity. I think this is a perfect part for a part of our life coach certification. So when I'm teaching our master coaches, so after you graduate from our life coach school, you get the ability of working together with us in the M&M, which is like a program where we help develop master coaches. One of the things that we talk about a lot inside of that program is that life is 50-50. Like the emotions that you experience are 50-50. There's going to be 50% great emotions and 50% bad emotions. Now I say quotes because they're just emotions. That's just the way they are. They're fueled by our thoughts and our stories. That's what gets us to feel a certain way, right? But trying to run or hide or buffer or push down is not the solution to that. Instead, it's called processing. We actually teach a process called processing pain, where you're able to like actually see the pain, the feeling that you're kind of running from, and instead process it. A lot of that has to do with like saying it out loud, thinking about it, seeing the power that it has over you, naming it, doing those things, but being mindful about it. Because it's not just like, it's not a part of you. It's just you thought that thought for a second, or you felt that way for a little bit. But you can get beyond it, right? It's not using it as shame to make it mean something about you. It's just, oh, that's just something that I thought. That's just something that came into my mind. It doesn't make you a bad person. Maybe there's some adjustments that you want to make in the future to some of the actions and some of the behaviors, but also it all starts in here in your mind, right? And instead of you thinking that this is something that is like, or portraying by having a conversation, basically saying that you're feeling wrong, like you shouldn't feel this way. Have you ever heard people say that, like, suck it up, buttercup? I mean, I can't tell you how many times I heard that in the police field, right? It's basically saying your emotions don't matter, just do your job, right? And I can't tell you that doesn't really make me want to do my job to the level that I can potentially do my job, right? Instead, talking about it and having these conversations and being more mindful about it and how it doesn't have control over you, then in reality, if you want to, just like how we teach in a life coach school, you can actually lean into your heart instead of your head, and you can find a different path to get there, okay? All right. Now, all of these things, empathy, it's really, she says, rooted in being curious. She says, engage, stay curious, let go of the fear of saying something wrong, the need to fix it. That is not empathy, by the way. And the desire to offer the perfect response that cures everything, because that's not going to happen. You don't have to do it perfectly. Just do it. Now, let me tell you, having done this for now years, I still mess up. I still make the wrong decisions. I still try and fix things. Oh, well, my son brought me this, so he must want the 4 different steps. Why don't I make a YouTube video at it and give them the 4 different steps that he could follow, right? I'll get more watch time. But in reality, it's like he doesn't want me to fix his problem. A lot of times, he just wants me to listen. And then afterwards, sometimes he is like, hey, can you help me fix this? And sometimes he's just like, man, I feel better not having this conversation, right? So I want to give you an example of what happened in the situation at my son's school that really helped me learn this empathy in action. So he had been getting picked on by this kid, and the kid's kind of smaller than him, but he's kind of like that bully who tries to be funny. He puts things on people's backs, the Post-it notes and whatnot. And he was saying things to my son, and my son was like very upset by it. And when he came home, he was like, hey, you know what? I'm really upset because this kid is saying these certain things about me. And I remember having a couple conversations with him, and the dad police officer in me was like, okay, let's go into the principal's office. I'm going to sit down. Let's figure it out. And I'm like, wait. Nope. That is me fixing the problem. Let me empower my son to fix it, right? And so what I did is, after having a conversation with him, I used what we use as the lead model. And I'm like, hey, buddy, it sounds like you're very you're upset that he keeps talking to you like that. I'm like, I remember when I was in school too, like whenever kids would talk to me, in a way that made me feel upset, like I got really angry and furious too. Like I would probably feel the exact same way if I was in your situation too. What do you think you could do from here? What is something you think you can do that would make this so that this would stop? And the first time that I asked him that question, he kind of like stopped for a second. And I could see that he like a little bit disattached from it because he was waiting probably for me to fix it, which is what I typically would have done. But instead of I empowered him, and he came up with a plan. Ultimately, a couple days later, actually maybe I think a week later, he came back and he said, Dad, you know what? I ended up going to my teacher that day and nothing happened. And then I went to go to the vice principal and I told her about it. And she told me that so many other kids had said the same thing about him. And that now that I had come forward, like I was kind of like protecting all the other kids, because now they were going to talk to him and they were going to, even suspend him from school for a little bit of time because of the type of things that he was doing to kids. And I could see in that conversation, like how proud he was that he was able to solve that, right? And let me tell you, it would have been much different if I had gone out there and tried to solve it myself versus giving him the tools, but also getting him to see like, man, I remember getting picked on too. Like maybe I didn't have that same situation that happened to him, which I was like, I've never had that situation happen to me, buddy, but I have been picked on before. And I can tell you, like, I would be frustrated too. I would be angry too, because that's what I was in the past. Like, And basically I'm letting him know that it's okay to feel that way, because that's the way that I even felt back then. And then empowering him by saying, what do you think it is that we can do? Now, when you get to the end, what I typically do is I will ask them what it is they think they could do. And also I will offer, like, I'll say something like, would you like me to give you some advice, or would you like me to just listen, right? It's a way of like me finding out if once we get to the end, he's like, yeah, I do want some advice, or I just want to listen, right? I use that a lot, even with like Teresa, my wife, because I know that sometimes I want to rush in and help fix it. And so I'll ask when those situations come up, like, hey, do you want me to just listen, or do you want me to like coach you? Do you want me to help you through this? Because I don't just automatically jump into that. At least I don't if I'm doing it right, so that she can like feel like secure enough to go, yes, I do, or no, I just want to listen, which is what happens most of the time. All right. So that gives you like sort of like an example of how you could use this. Did I do it perfectly? I did not do it perfectly. I wish I had done it earlier, actually. But it gives us all an opportunity to go out there and practice it, knowing that it's not going to be right. It's not going to be best. You're not going to say one thing that's immediately going to feel amazing and incredible, because that didn't happen, because I had talked to him many, many other times before about this situation, and I was never able to like help him out as much as I was that last time. But it took a lot of practice to being able to do that. And I know you guys can do that too. All right. Empathy misses. Let's go through this real quick and we'll be done. All right. So empathy miss number 1, she says, getting, I guess, not understanding the difference between sympathy versus empathy. She said in the situation that she was in, which you could read about in the book, she says, if her friend had said, I'm so sorry, you poor thing, or I can't imagine how hard this must be for you, she said she didn't feel bad for me. She felt pain with me, which is what empathy is. Empathy is kind of like, I'm feeling pain with you because I kind of see it from your perspective, but not feeling bad for somebody. Like, I'm so sorry for you kind of thing. When we do that, we actually do the opposite, all right, of actually connecting. We're trying to use sympathy, and that is definitely not the solution to shame. Empathy miss number 2 is the gasp and awe. So if you go, oh, I'm appalled, it's also not a good way of connecting. Next one is the mighty fall, meaning the person says after you're having a conversation with them, you tell them like what it is that's going on. They're like, I'm very disappointed in you. I'm disappointed in the way that you felt. I'm disappointed in the way that you acted. You're bringing it back to them and you're using shame again. The next one is the block and tackle. How did you let this happen? What were you thinking? Or what we can also do is try to actually focus on the other person. What's wrong with that guy? What? I'm gonna go over, I'm gonna report him, or I'm gonna go kick his, well, I'm not gonna say that because that's what she wrote in here, but it's like, instead of you connecting to their feelings, you're giving power to the outside world instead of what's actually going on in here. Next one is the boots and shovel. This is the person who says, it's really not that bad. It can't be that bad. You're really awesome. You're really amazing. You'll get over this. That's basically trying to get them to force and push down their emotions. And then empathy miss number 6 is if you think that's bad, this is the person that confuses connection with the opportunity to one up. That's nothing. Let me tell you about how my performance evaluation in 1994 happened in the 4th quarter. And you are using yourself as kind of like a way of like one-upping. And once again, you're pushing down and suppressing somebody else's. She says there's a couple of questions that she uses when she thinks about our part of skill building. She says, based off of the things you learned around empathy in this chapter, when you think about those 6 types of empathy misses, are there 1 or 2 that shut you down? Whether it's the gasp and awe, the mighty fall, the block and tackle, sympathy versus empathy, the boots and shovel, just come on. It's not too bad. If you think that's bad, you should check out like which 1 or 2 actually gets you heading in the wrong direction. She says, what emotions come up for you when your sharing meets one of these barriers, and how does that affect your connection with the other person? So when that happens, when somebody does those things, how does it affect you? Number 3, on the flip side, how do you rate your own empathetic skill? Are you using those other skills? Are there some ones that you can work on? And number 4, are there 1 or 2 responses that you typically use that you need to change? Maybe going back and even revisiting, if you're a business owner, some of the messages that you're sending people or some of the conversations that you're having with your family, thinking about, is there a common phrase that you use that could be creating more shame than creating empathy? And this is all like a learning journey for all of us, me, myself included. It's like, how can I continue to get better and just elevate myself to the next level. And it starts by being vulnerable, by realizing like, hey, I need to get a little bit better in this area, but it's not having anything to do with me as a person. It's just another skill that I can develop, right? All right. She says, I agree to practice empathy, screw it up, circle back, clean it up, and try again. I think that's something we should all write in Post-it notes. I agree to practice empathy, screw it up, circle back, clean it up, and try it again. She says, you have no idea how much it means to someone when you circle back and say, you shared something hard with me, and I wish I had shown up in a different way. I really care about you and what you shared. Can I try again? Now that is daring leadership. Now, when she talks about like empathy, she also at the end of this talks about like having empathy for yourself. And she says, if we're willing to practice empathy with other people, then we should be willing to talk to yourself the way that you'd talk to someone you love. So think about that. Like, yes, we're talking about some of the people that we communicate with, social media, business, personal, whatever. But in reality, the person that we're talking to the most in our own brain, 50,000 thoughts, they say a day, is ourselves. So we have to be willing to talk to yourself the way that you would talk to a loved one. Like they say, would you kiss your mom with that mouth? And there's some real truth to that, right? Like if you had somebody in your life that you really deeply cared and respected, and they were going through the same thing, how would you talk to them? And are you using that to talk to yourself? Or are you using, just suck it up, come on, you have to get through this, just push through? Are you using that kind of approach? When in reality, if you were talking to somebody else, you would never use that kind of approach. Just really check in with this, okay? She talks about the last part is like empathy and shame resilience. There's a couple different practices that she talks about. One is recognizing shame and understanding its triggers, like what's triggering you. This could be you moving away, which is withdrawing, hiding, silencing ourselves, or keeping secrets. Moving towards, which seeking to appease and please, or moving against, trying to gain power over others by being aggressive. And there's 4 other ones, but this is the end of that chapter, where she just really talks about resilience. Shame resilience is being able to experience like some of the shame, realize it, call out to it, bring awareness to it, figure out how you can use empathy instead, not only for other people, but also for yourself, and realizing that this is a process, right? Realizing it's a process. I remember somewhere in this chapter, she also talks about this. She also talks about like, she's not a fan of anything brutal, including brutal honesty. Because here's the thing, sometimes we can say, hey, I just want like honesty, right? And there's a difference between communicating it and being brutally honest. I totally agree. Brutally honest is also not something that I want to experience either. I don't want anybody else to experience that either, because I want them to be able to see that I can see it in an empathetic way and not shame, guilt, or humiliate them into taking a different action, right? I want to show them what's possible. I want to be the hope for them. I want to be there to remind them of their purpose, of their potential, of all those things, all those heart voices, right? And by being able to do that, being willing to like not only read this book, guys, which is I'm super freaking proud of you. For those of you guys who are reading this book, who are leaning in, who are still here at the end of this session, like being willing to do these uncomfortable things, because like we said, shame, vulnerability, embarrassment, like all of these things are difficult things to actually talk about. But it also gives us the greatest ability of like really connecting with people, because the truth is a lot of leaders are not going to be willing to lean into this. They're going to have already been disconnected. They're going to have already like stopped and not even continue to read the book. But I think what's so powerful is if you're here, it is literally evidence that you are who the world needs right now. They need leaders like you. So I appreciate you so much, not only for reading this book, but for being the leader who's willing to be empathetic, for willing to like be vulnerable, seeing where the holes are in your strategies so that you can, number one, take that armor off, but also be willing to create the kind of environment, whether it's in your business, on your social media, on your YouTube, where shame and guilt is not tolerated. And instead you lean into empathy and you can really connect with people on an entirely different level. Now, if you made it your way here all the way to the end and you're not a part of our book club, definitely, I will leave you the information inside of this video, inside of the description. Click on it, sign up, join our book club. We're going to be starting a new book sometime next month. I will be actually reaching out to people really soon to figure out what that book is. I'll also leave you all of the replays, including the free access into our community inside of the description. Lastly, is you heard me talk a lot about life coaching here. I actually help develop coaches after I help them understand their belief system and how they can help themselves and other people to get through and past self-sabotage, not only in their life, but their health, their business, all those kind of things. I teach them how to become master coaches. As a part of that process, master coaches have to get enough practice in to be able to not only develop their skills, but get really good at helping multiple people in multiple situations. Now, normally it costs hundreds of dollars for a session, but as of right now, me and Josh, who's the co-creator of our program, the Push Coach Certification School, we're allowing some people to get free access to our master coaches and master coaches in training to do one free session. If that's something that you're interested in, let me put it here. If you go to modernleadership.com, modernleadership.us/coach call, you can actually schedule a free call with one of our master coaches. And it's a game changer, not only when it comes to what we're talking about here today, when it comes to leadership, but also when it comes to business, when it comes to personal life. And yes, it does not matter if you have a business or not. It doesn't matter any of those things. If you're somebody who wants to learn a little bit more about the subconscious mind and see what a coaching session could do for you, definitely sign up, get into one of those free coaching calls. There's no catches or anything with it. It's not going to cost you money to do it. If you enjoy it, definitely lean in, because at that point, maybe this is something that you'd want to develop too. But I appreciate you guys for being here, for being willing to lean in, like I said, to this uncomfortableness. And if you haven't yet, I know Amber shared a ton of different takeaways. Please share your takeaways in the comment section here. And I'm actually going to go through a couple right now. From Amber. Amber says, empathy, what it really is and how to practice it, what to do and absolutely not to do, and how it has no roadmap. It's all about reading each other, so to speak. 100%, Amber. I love that. Julie says, shame. We also have to have the right listeners, choosing well. This is so critical, guys, too. This is something that, Julie, thank you very much for bringing this up. It's something we got to pay attention to, all right? Because sometimes we won't share things because of the environment we're in, because we fear being shamed. But remember, if you're a leader, it's your job not to create that kind of environment for your people, right? You want to make sure that that is not something that happens in front of you. This is a moment of vulnerability. So if somebody comes up and uses shame in front of you, you have to put on your daring to lead book hat and say, I'm going to lean into this. I'm actually going to call this out, not call it out in a shameful or guiltful way, but lean into hey, let's figure out a different way of approaching this that would be more leading into empathy, right? Because that's so true. This is the reason why we're having this discussion, right? Because there's environments that are created that people don't want to speak up because they feel they're going to be shamed or guilted or humiliated or embarrassed. And when we have that kind of environment, it is our responsibility and duty as a leader to change it. Sometimes we can't change up, even though I will caution you to think that way, because I definitely can tell you, I definitely changed up the LAPD because of the way that I was approaching things, where they started to take on some of the different approaches that I was having. It took a little bit longer, but you can 100% make sure you're creating that environment for the people that you are leading. So such a very good point, Julie. Amber says, I too was trying to advertise business with those words. I changed things up so fast and it helped my business exponentially. Yes, Amber, when we start leading with ways to connect with people rather than leading with shame, guilt, humiliation, which makes people feel bad. Like, you're not like me. Everybody has 24 hours in a day, all those kind of things. You're going to see that most of the people who say that, I don't really know many people who are successful in that, because they're not really connecting with the people who are getting that message, right? It's crazy though too, because you'll have a group of people who've also been successful, and they'll jump on board with you and go, yeah, we all have 24 hours in a day. But the people that you're trying to connect with, people you're trying to lead, are like, I'm out, peace, see you later. And it's crazy how quickly that happens. And it gives us a great opportunity instead to really connect with them rather than push them away. All right. All right, guys. Definitely love the book. We probably have maybe 2 more book breakdowns. The next chapter is going to be about, and this is a good one too, this is daring leaders who live into their values. So this is all about living into your values, which I think is super critical, because anytime that we're off track when it comes to our values, that's when we're feeling like we're not being the true, authentic version of us. We really don't show up as a leader we want to be. And I know that's not you guys. I know you guys are ready to dive into this, but keep reading. I appreciate you so much. And yeah, you guys have a really incredible weekend. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you guys soon. All right, bye everybody.